Hello, everyone, and welcome to our today's event, which is organized jointly by Critic Lab and Perspect Lab. So these are two research units within the Institute. Both of them are relatively new. These laboratories, they gather researchers dealing with certain topics and issues. So Perspect Lab deals with issues of space, the urban phenomena, and basically their relation to philosophy and social theory. And Critic Lab, which is the lab which I coordinate, is devoted to issues of social critique. So both of these laboratories basically they overlap a lot, and our event today is very much at the intersection of these of the interests of these laboratories. Our guest today is Professor Dario Gentili. He is professor of philosophy at the University of Roma III, but he was born in Naples in 1975, if I'm correct. So he's associate professor in moral philosophy at Roma III, and he has a PhD in ethics and political legal philosophy from the University of Salerno, which is in southern Italy as well. He did his postdoctoral research in philosophy and the history of ideas at the SUM, which is the Italian Institute of Human Sciences in Florence. And then he received a DAAD postdoctoral grant to work at the Walter Benjamin Archive in Berlin. After that, he became a research fellow at the SUM, the Italian Institute of Human Sciences, and in autumn 2014, he was also visiting researcher at the Heinrich Heine Universität Düsseldorf. He has written a number of monographs and many research articles, also essays, which have been translated into English and other languages, and among his works, the most important monographs are Il tempo della storia, le tesi sul concetto di storia di Walter Benjamin 2002, topografie politiche, spazio urbano, cittadinanza, confini, Walter Benjamin e Jacques Derrida 2009, Italian theory dall'operaismo alla biopolitica 2012, and his most recent book, The Age of Precarity, which we will discuss today in some more detail. We have here with Professor Gentili a number of commentators on the book, and let me just briefly present them both for our guest and for the audience. So we have here Alexandra Knežević, who is a research associate at our institute, who is a philosopher by training, but now is doing a PhD in anthropology. We have Andrea Perunović, who finished his PhD. It's a joint PhD between University of Paris 8, right?
It's only Paris 8.
Only Paris 8, but he was also spent some time in Switzerland at, what's the name of the institution?
European Graduate School.
European Graduate School, a very, very good institution, yes. So he deals primarily with issues of trust and also a range of contemporary philosophical perspectives. Srđan Prodanović, my good friend and also colleague from the Institute, a senior research fellow. He did his PhD here in Belgrade. He's a sociologist like myself, but a theoretical sociologist specializing in contemporary pragmatism and issues of social contingency, complexity, and basically the potential for social change in these present-day conditions. We have here on the other side Milan Urošević, who is also a sociologist and a research associate at the Institute. He recently completed his PhD in sociology, also a theoretical sociologist primarily, very much dealing with the topics that are addressed in your book as well, with neoliberalism as a dispositive. He's a Foucauldian, and he has analyzed the literature of contemporary literature as self-help as a technique of subjectivation within the contemporary neoliberal regime of government. And we have here Igor Cvejić, a philosopher as well, a research fellow at the Institute, He's specializing, on the one hand, in Kant's philosophy, on the other hand, in social ontology, philosophy of emotions, collective intentionality, and related topics. And we have also in the audience, we have George Christov, who has also recently joined us at the Institute, a philosopher, very much specializing in Hegel's philosophy and various related topics. And we have Damir Zainulahovic, also a somewhat younger researcher doing his PhD in sociology and interested in, somewhat similar to Milan, in issues of critical theory, post-structuralism, and related phenomena. And who are we missing here? Are we missing anyone? Peter is our final participant, and you already know him. So I think if we have introduced everyone, I would now like to give the word to Professor Gentili to briefly present this very, very stimulating and interesting book dealing with phenomena of crisis, precarity, neoliberalism from a very original and synthetic perspective. Please, Professor Gentili.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you all for to discuss my book. A lot of people, we finish tomorrow, I think. With this
That's how our seminars work, basically.
Okay, it's a rave, it's not a seminar.
Yes.
During all the night long. Okay, and okay, thank you for me. It's a special thanks to Peter. He's a friend, and I'm very happy to be here for the second time. This time at home for me, because the last time I was in architecture faculty. So. I'm very, very happy to be here. I find this one an important opportunity for discuss my book. So I prepared not so long presentation, but I can say more a kind of provocation, no, for the discussion.
Sure.
Sorry, I have to read because I'm not so sure about my English. So, the Italian edition of The Age of Precarity, Crisi come arte di governo, was published in 2018. It was a work of a few years that moved from the economic crisis of 2007-2008. At that time, you may recall, there was much talk of a crisis of neoliberalism, of a crisis that will present an opportunity to end neoliberal hegemony. However, it soon became clear that this will not be the case. It was said that this crisis will lead to the end of neoliberalism if an alternative was presented. And as an alternative to neoliberalism, neo-sovereignisms and neo-populisms were presented. Yet they seemed to me to be an aspect of the same crisis rather than its solution, a way to perpetuate it. Indeed, it is perhaps only from this moment onwards that neoliberalism reveals its true essence, that biopolitics that Foucault had prefigured in his course at the Collège de France. Unlike a classical liberalism, neoliberalism requires the intervention of the state to respond to the demand for security and control that market fluctuations and entrepreneurial risk engender. Precariousness, then, is not only the outcome of uncertain market dynamics, but also the form of life that requires protection and safety in order to survive. Rather than representing the moment of decision and turning point, as modernity in its revolutionary phase has led us to think, this crisis is functional to an act of government, still according to Foucault, who defines neoliberalism as governmentality. Through the genealogy of the term crisis and its use, I became aware that the link between economic crisis and political crisis, which opens up the possibility of a revolutionary use of economic crisis, was a legacy of a certain modernity, a parenthesis within a much longer history. I realized that the real matrix of the economic crisis was medical and legal, and corresponds to a very precise mode of judgment. Judgment for or against, between alternatives in opposition to each other, but where the choice is already oriented, if not actually forced. Medical judgment is not about what is a good life, but about keeping the individual alive, however precarious his or her condition may be. Similarly, the forensic judgment, the one that takes place in court, does not direct one to a good life, but sentences the guilt or innocence of the individual, his or her responsibility to the current order. The Age of Precarity comes out for Verso in 2021, when we were amid a global health crisis. In Italy, but not only in Italy, we have often heard it said that the policies of the states have finally made the health of the population prevail over economic interests. Once again, there has been talk of a crisis in the neoliberal model, as if health and the economy were alternatives. Politics would finally rebel against its subordination to the market, finally regaining its autonomy from the economy. Yet, regarding the documents of the major neoliberal institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in autumn 2020, the policies suggested are exactly those undertaken by the most of the states, first and foremost the lockdown. As with medical judgment in ancient Greece, neoliberal policies assume care for the health of the population, health that ends up corresponding to the human capital whose resources are to be preserved. Thus, health and economics are closely intertwined, far from being opposed. What the economic crisis of 2007-2008 and the COVID-19 health crisis seem to have in common is the condition of individual precariousness, which makes the crisis an art of government when political decisions for the population are forced, established by a judgment that leaves no alternatives. I'm not arguing that these are not real emergencies. The ecological crisis is another one, but rather that, in general, political decision-making is reduced to the forced choice posed by the judgment of the crisis. Choice is based on alternatives that have already been posed, whereas the decision should involve a disclosure of unforeseen possibilities. I'm currently working on the decision mode of disclosure. With this term, I think of the German Entschlossenheit, to be clearly distinguished from Carl Schmitt's Entscheidung, with which the young Heidegger translates the Greek euboulia, that means good deliberation in assembly, in common. I believe that the practice of disclosure can represent an exit from the neoliberal state of nature. Precariousness, in fact, consists in the neoliberal valorization of an anthropological condition. From being a natural condition of human being, precariousness has become a form of working, social, and political life of the individual that requires a therapy to be followed in order not to succumb to the crisis. I now come to the latest crisis we're experiencing, which is also often presented as the end of market hegemony over politics, the war in Ukraine. As with any war, the health and economic repercussions are obvious, but I find a further aspect of continuity between this war, the economic crisis of 2007-2008, and the health crisis caused by COVID-19 pandemic. It is precisely the mode of judgment of the crisis that I find prevailing in the order of discourse that the war has shaped in the West. In the alignment that the debate on this war demands, I see a confirmation of the judgment of the crisis, which is always expressed within a clear alternative between two opposite options. Does it not also seem to you that in the state of emergency or war, a starting position is required between extreme options, such as good and evil, right and wrong, life and death, and that the judgment of the crisis resonates in it? My impression is that the alignment that the judgment requires also entails the validation and endorsement of an order, the neoliberal one, and in its totality and entirety. And that order is founded on precariousness, where one chooses to make chronic, that is, administer, that precariousness rather than decide for a good life. Political decision-making should not choose between pre-established alternatives. It should not be reduced to administrative cures to make precariousness chronic. Rather, it should disclose the field of possibility for a good life, as opposed to the closure of the dry alternative, which is essentially the absence of real alternatives. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much for this great introduction. And as you noticed, this very succinct subtitle of the book, "Crisis is an Art of Government," is the book's central thesis, basically. Crisis not as a threat to government, but as the very modus of government, as an art of government. And of course, now we will have the opportunity to discuss this in some more detail. We will have 3 small sessions. In each session, there will be 3 speakers, 3 commentators, and then you will be given an opportunity to respond. And in our first session, yes?
Just one question.
Yes?
Because I read Italian edition, and there is a difference in the title. Why the title in English is like this? And who proposed you this kind of title? Can you explain us?
Yes, certainly.
It's not a so deep philosophical reason. It's because the crisis as an art of government in English was already proposed to another editor. So Verso had to change the title, and I proposed this title, The Age of Precarity, with a subtitle that reprised the Italian title.
There is a difference in the construction of the book, Italian English?
No, it's different. No, it's not. The construction of the book is the same, but with the opportunity to translate the book before in Germany, into German, because the book in 2020 was published as Krise als Regierungskunst in German, and then I continue to work on the book. So the English edition is a more precise, more thief edition than the first Italian edition. So in this moment, when the Italian edition was, the first Italian edition was sold out. But it's not a concept, but I think it's sold out, the expression. I published the second edition on the basis of the English translation, because I still working in 2-3 years after the first edition on the book for the translation and so on. Crisi come arte di governo. In English, it's crisis as an art of government.
It's interesting that the other guest, Manuel Orazzi, published this book in edition for Liberty. I hope he's the editor, principal editor for Liberty. Can you say like that?
Yeah. Manuel is a friend, but we collaborate more on architectural stuffs.
Fine, but for liberty public.
Yeah. But I'm not in touch directly with him for the philosophical.
Fine, good.
No, it is a joke, but Manuel, it's very important to find a review on the book on the right journals, because he said all the time that I find only left journals for the reviews. So this is the Manuel's function.
Can you just one small question before we start, just on, because it's on the topic of the title. Why did you choose as an art of governmentality? Is it is it done on purpose, or the crisis is the art of governmentality? Why you choose the proposition that is not?
This is a choice
How
of.
it is in Italian? Is it?
There is no an art. This crisi come arte di governo.
But
In English, is
governo.
crisis as art of government.
Yes.
This I don't know.
Well,
it sounds better for the English.
It has to be
Yeah,
there
yeah.
in English. It has to be
It
there.
has to be in
You
English.
can't just have crisis as art of government.
As the art.
That would mean that it would be the
The,
only
the
possible,
only one. Yeah,
which
that
means-
was where I was pointing
And
at.
that, I guess, would not be correct, because there are other arts of governments
Sure.
preceding this art of government.
Sure.
My point
Okay.
is that crisis is not only this neoliberal crisis.
Okay.
No? It's a kind of crisis. There is other ways to think and to practice crisis.
So,
Yeah.
in our first session, we have three speakers. We have Alexandra, we have Andrea, and we have Igor. And we can start with Alexandra's intervention.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for letting me speak first, to be the first one to speak. And I would like to start with, so my main question is then how to overcome the neoliberal form of governing the crisis, and how to overcome this state of affairs where crisis is an art of government. So I guess that's also the main question of your book, and I would like to discuss it further. And I was thinking that maybe my contribution here could be that I present the main argument from your book, or some aspects of your main argument that are most interesting to me, and that would be an introduction for me to ask my question or to contribute to this discussion somehow. So, and I guess I will focus mostly on the first part of the book, where you differentiate between three forms of governing the crisis, and you say that the first form of governing the crisis is happening or is placed in the ancient world, the second one in the modern period, and the third one, and the third period is the contemporary current neoliberal era. And as I understand it, you argue that these three forms of governing the crisis are different, and in order to explain how they are different, you introduce the notion of for and against the judgments. And I would like to discuss this notion of for and against judgment, because my intuition tells me that this is the problem, the main problem that we have in our current contemporary societies, that we present only two possibilities, only two alternatives. And you say that in these three periods, the context of crisis was different, and as you already mentioned, the crisis was either medical, forensic, political, or economic. And in these contexts, the function of for and against the judgment was also different. And just for the sake of brevity, I will focus only on how you explain the art of governing the crisis in the modern period and in the current contemporary neoliberal era. So you say that in the modern period, the crisis was political, which basically means, as I understand it, that if there is a crisis, then the crisis is resolved by political means. So politics will intervene to resolve the crisis. And I guess you argue that politics do so by resorting to for and against the judgments. So in order to resolve the crisis, politics or people or the public or who is in the decision-making process decide between two alternatives. And I think it's important to emphasize that these alternatives are equally viable alternatives. And you also say that in the modernity, the second alternative was introduced. And the first alternative is that we should re-establish the existing order, and that the second new alternative we should overturn the existing order. So that's a more liberatory, revolutionary type of politics. And I think the important assumption here in this type of reasoning is that the existing order is not the reason why there is a crisis. And since the existing order is not the reason why we are in crisis, therefore, one of the possibilities is to re-establish the existing order. And then, I guess, yes, it's also important to say that in this sense, when we are in this how, if we conceptualize the crisis in this way, then the decision or the for or against the judgment is a decisive judgment. So if we opt for either of these two options, we will be in a position to resolve the crisis once and for all, hopefully. And I guess this is the point where the neoliberal conception of crisis and also Marx's conception of crisis are different. And I would also like to explain briefly how they are different, because I would like to be critical about how Marx and the neoliberal conception of crisis, what is Marx and what is neoliberal conception of crisis. So very briefly, I think that Marx would disagree with the assumption that the existing order is not the reason why there is crisis. And as I understand it from your book, for Marx, the existing order, the neoliberal order is crisis itself. So this is the crisis. And since this is the crisis, in order to resolve the crisis, we are not faced with two alternatives. We have only one alternative, and that is the alternative is the revolution. So we can only overthrow the existing order in order to overcome the crisis. So, and in that sense, I think, I would argue, I'm not sure that you are explicit about that in your book, but in the case of Marx, the decision is also forced. So we are not faced with two possible alternatives. We have only one alternative, and that is the revolution, the economic revolution, or the revolution that aims at changing the economic system, economic policies, and so on. And in that sense, then, as I understand it, there is a similarity between how Marx understands the crisis and how crisis is understood and in the neoliberal era. And as you argue, the similarity is that they share the same lack of alternative. And in the neoliberal era, in order to get out of economic crisis, the only alternative that we have, in contrast to Marx, or in contrast to Marx, is to re-establish and introduce new neoliberal economic policies. So we have to, again, justify and legitimize the current economic order that we have in order to get out of the crisis. And that's exactly the point of departure with Marx, because Marx, as I understand it, believes that if we re-establish the existing order, we will end up in an endless crisis. So, and in that sense, also in the neoliberal conception of crisis, the decision or the for and against judgment is a forced decision. So we have to choose the only one alternative that we have. And that's in the case of neoliberalism to just legitimize and further justify and maintain the liberal policies that we have. So, and how I understand, if you agree with me that this interpretation of your argument is a correct one, accurate one, then I guess I would like then to maybe emphasize this function of for or against the judgments in all these three forms of governing the crisis. And it seems to me that the assumption is that if we resort to this kind of judgments, we are in start making a wrong step. And why I believe so, it's because we are faced, in fact, with a false dilemma. So if we believe that there are only two possible alternatives, or even only one possible alternative to re-establish or to overturn the existing order, then we are not presenting all the possibilities that are present. And so that's my understanding, and I think that also you agree with that, and I think that's somehow implicit in the end of your book and also in your introduction today. So, and I was thinking then, what would be the solution? So how to get out of this neoliberal type form of governing the crisis? And I was thinking that maybe in contrast to Marx, who says that the crisis is economic, and in order to fight the crisis, we have to fight at the level of economy, the level of economic system. I was thinking that maybe, and that's, I guess, my question to you. So would you agree, and maybe would you like to further discuss that issue. So instead of having an economic revolution, we could have a social revolution. And that social revolution would maybe focus more, concentrate more on how to change the way of our reasoning, how we think about politics and how we think about the possibilities that we have, and how do we think about the possibilities from which we can choose in order to resolve crises in our society, in our personal life, and so on. So, and this, when I say social revolution, I mean just basically the revolution in the way how we discuss with each other. And it seems to me that this way of discussing and trying to choose between two alternatives is the reason why we are endlessly in the state of crisis. And then my question would be, yes, do you agree with me? And yes, I'm not sure. So this is not my area of research. So is there maybe such, how can I say, am I sharing some intuitions with anyone from who are discussing these issues? So when I say social revolution, I'm thinking about that enlarged mentality. So how we approach each other, how we are discussing, how we are trying to not only discuss on the levels of two possibilities, and because I think that if we are doing so, that's only partial truth. So every possibility, every alternative, two alternatives that we had are just partial truths, and maybe the truth is in the middle. So yes, if you could maybe discuss it further.
Thank you.
Okay, Andrea?
Thank you. So yeah, thank you. I must say just for the beginning that I'm really glad to have the opportunity to discuss this really thought-provoking book. Yeah, I will just repeat some theses that Alexandra told, like really briefly, but I think it's important to say that you propose that the judgment for or against, understood as a forced choice between two opposing alternatives, is the predominant mode of judgment in our neoliberal cultures. So you claim very, very, very wittingly that this kind of judgment produces no decision. This kind of judgment preserves the ruling order by not producing a decision, or rather, as you claim, it administers it. So, in that sense, I would like to ask you if you think that crisis, in which this kind of judgment becomes predominant, or crisis, which is that kind of judgment tout court, represents an obstacle for the process of reflection, for the very thought itself. Let me please just explain myself a little bit further. In the critique of faculty of judgment, Kant is making a distinction between the determining judgment and the reflexive judgment. In the first of the two modes of judgment, in the determining judgment, the universal rule, which is an empirical concept, is given in advance. And the action of judging consists in a simple subsumption of particular cases, sensible intuitions, under the pre-given universal rule, the one which is presupposed. This implies that the mentioned universal rule is never examined or taught. It is simply applied. In addition to that, the particular isn't examined either, because it is simply an element of knowledge given by our senses. Deleuze claimed that this kind of judgment doesn't have any creative or productive potential, but is rather constitutive, proliferating, and distributive in its character. Hannah Arendt goes even to call the determining judgment a frozen thought, a thought that has happened elsewhere when the very empirical concept was forged, when a universal rule was established, which is not forcefully a temporally locatable place in time, neither in space, but we can discuss that. So this kind of frozen thought can later on be just displaced and repeated. So my first question would be, can this determining judgment, as conceived by Kant, can somehow relate to the judgment in crisis, thus maybe showing us how in the scenarios of crisis or the crisis dispositif, the thought is replaced by trust or belief. Do we have an opportunity to think in crisis, or our last resort in this kind of, you say, perpetual situation is actually trust? Okay, I will now try to continue a bit further, because there is the other type of Kantian judgment, which is really also very interesting to reflect upon in the context of crisis, because maybe it discloses, as you told in your introduction, the subversive side to it, okay? So, the subversive side of judgment. Namely, the second type of judgment that Kant proposes is the reflexive judgment. In the reflexive judgment, on the contrary to the determining one, the universal rule is missing. There is only the particular case. So the action of judging must take its departure from the very particular case in order to find the universal rule, which is somehow pending, awaiting to be discovered. Again, Deleuze, when explaining this kind of Kantian judgment, gives a medical example that I will try to resume and paraphrase here briefly. Say you go to the doctors with a very high fever. He can't really say if you're having a really bad flu or a septic infection, a septicemia. So he gives you antibiotics and wait to see if the fever goes down. He does analysis, whatever. If it does, very well. If not, it is septicemia, you need to get hospitalized really quickly. So it seems that the moment Deleuze describes is a moment of crisis in which the very concept, the universal rule, is problematic. It is missing. The role of judgment is thus to find and to formulate it. So does this suddenly makes place for thought in crisis, for some kind of creative process of concept making, something like that? Does this uncertainty opens up suddenly a space in which reflection is a part of the very action of judging? Deleuze also uses another example to describe the Kantian reflexive judgment, which is also in resonance with ones you use in your book. This is namely the one of jurisprudence, a legal phenomenon which he uses to describe the creative, anarchic philosophy of law, in which the judge must create the law, so to say, on the premises of a particular case, thus making out of a crisis a judgment and a decision which are not directed top-down or pre-given or presupposed, but where the actor itself brings up on what the rule will be, an individual. So here's yet another crisis that seemed to imply decision from the actor as a very substantive part of judgment. Okay, this is where I will stop with this question, or this set of questions, if you want, and go on to the second one. So my second remark concerns the way that you use the notion of disease. I'm very, very curious about this question, in its opposition to the notion of health. In order to determine the context of medical judgment, and moreover to read the multiple historical meanings of crisis, which, as you write, were dominated by the medical sense until the 18th century. But does the very change in reading of the relation between health and disease in the 19th century, or between the normal and the pathological, as the French philosopher Georges Canguilhem formulates it, could inform a different light, a different logic of our understanding of crisis? Namely, Canguilhem stresses that the difference between the normal and the pathological state should be viewed in terms of quantity rather than in terms of quality. He goes on to say that between the normal healthy state and the pathological state provoked by the disease, there is no real difference, so to say. That they're in fact identical in so much that the disease, and here Canguilhem calls upon Nietzsche, shows the normal processes that are hard to be seen in the normal state. If crisis is, for the ancient medicine, the most acute period of disease, as you write, how could Canguilhem's reversal of the traditional difference between the normal and the pathological could help us kind of reconceptualize it? Do this understanding of health and disease as qualitatively identical could offer a framework for a response to the contemporary state of permanent crisis, or somehow subvert it? And just, I will finish now. My third and last question is how the decision without judgment escapes the dictate, the rule of trust, which annihilate all possibility for thought and thinking as an integral, if not the fundamental element of neoliberal regimes. Here I mean trust as kind of a fundamental element of neoliberal regimes. Isn't the prevalence of how on what to do, as you say in the conclusion, in which you see the emancipatory potential that would get us rid of the dispositif of crisis, can it be obtained rather in what Derrida called the test, l'épreuve, of undecidability, in the moment of suspense that makes a free decision possible in the first place? So is the emancipatory place for emancipation, or some kind of space that would open up somehow before the decision and not in the very decision itself? Thank you.
Thanks. And Igor?
Thank you, Dario, for being here with us and for having opportunity to read your book, which is very actual in the current situation. It's obvious. I will have I will go somewhere on the line that Andrea started with a bit different way. I'm a bit impressed or have an impression that there is some kind of aesthetical background implicit in the book. I would say what associations I have. First, that the problem of judgment, as far as I know, became philosophically important, not just as a problem of the law and experts, with the problem of the taste. Of course, not only in the arts, but moral taste, on the question how it is possible that people who are not expert can have judgment which is intersubjective in some way. And of course, aesthetics became the area where this is mostly discussed in the early modern period. And then you finish your book with a solution with Nietzsche and Dionysian rapture, which is partly response to exactly this problem. And this problem is also connected with the idea, the teleological ideas, the idea of organism as living being, explicit in Baumgarten. And in this sense, in some way, I read your end of your book as some contrasting with teleological thinking again. So that was just intriguing to me. And my concrete question again will go to the Kant, to some particular interpretation of third critique as the crisis of judgment, which are implicit in Lyotard, for example, in some way were Hannah Arendt, and explicit in some contemporary authors as Scherer or Howard Keigel. So the basic idea that what Kant proposed in third critique, that there is the possibility of the crisis of judgment in terms that usual valid judgments are not possible in some cases. Nevertheless, those are the cases in which world discloses to us as meaningful. So we have meaningful situation of disclosing of the world, which are nevertheless exceed judgment as we know it. And some artists formulated that there is a crisis of crises in Kant's third critique, which is addressed. And what I'm interested for is the very gesture of Kant, not now here to go to his solution of the statical problem, the gesture to accept, okay, there is a situation, there is a crisis of judgment, and there is a, I think it's applicable to you, understanding of neoliberalism. There is a crisis of crises. So the moment in which we recognize that it would not be meaningful to make usual judgment, but there is a turning point, as in Kant, judgment of beauty and judgment of sublime and turning points, in which we have to make some judgment which is exceeds judgment as we know it. And that opened the portray of the political situation in a different way. So can we speak about the crisis or crisis in today's world, but which exceed possibility of the government to adopt it in the system, which will then be an entirely different type of the crisis to those who can be regulated by the system. And then open the question, is it, I'm a bit afraid when you say, okay, decision without judgment. It sounds better when you say, let us ask how and know what. But is it probably that we should find a way to understand judging and judgment in a different way in our political life by exceeding the judgment as it is? So that's my basic question.
Thanks. All right. And now Dario can answer.
Thank you. I don't know if I can answer all the questions, but it's also my English that it's limited to explain a very clear discourse. So I try to keep together some questions. Yeah, I start from Alexandra because there is also a question about this, the construction of the book. No, these three. This is three parts. It's I don't speak about the three kinds of crisis, but the three uses of crisis. So, starting from understand very clearly for me that crisis is a kind of judgment. It's not judgment. It's a precise kind of judgment. This judgment that implies the choice between one or another, between life and death, guilt, innocence, and so on. And the two stages, the two, as Freud can see, Zane, are the medical field and the court, the medical and forensic judgment. So, what is important for me is three different uses of this kind of judgment. So, in the Greek world, it was very clearly for me. The English editor say to me, but could you summarize the first chapter on this very philosophical question, ancient Greece and so on? But for me, it's very important because it's very clear what Plato, for example, intends for crisis. It's a particular kind of judgment. No, it's not a political judgment. It's something really very clear in Plato. It's something else. And other important issue for me, that this kind of judgment is a prerogative of the organization of the city. It's not something that outside the order, but it's something that implies the administration of the order. This is very important for me. So crisis is sure judgment pro or against, but also is a kind of dispositive of administration of the order. So we have to free our idea from modern time. So we think about collocation of the subject of the crisis, of the judgment outside the order. No, it is inside the order. When we, it's very interesting for me because we today we express our choice every day, continuously, pro or against, but it's not a decision to change the order, but it's inside this kind of discourse that repeats itself all the time. No, so I'm pro, I'm against, and we speak about this kind of, also I've wrote in the book also the election, the political election in Italy, but I think also here is a kind of referendum. And really something like I don't like. So this is, or my problem was how this kind of non-political judgment became, with neoliberalism, with this order, the judgment of the, within the order, that organize, that administrate the order. This was the question for me. So, in modern time, this kind, it's very common to have a judgment pro or against. The problem is which use we do of this kind of judgment. Marx is very, very interesting in this genealogy because he understood that critique was not enough to revolutionary the system, because crisis at the time of Marx, but not only, it was a kind of reinvigoration of the economical system. So you can criticize how you want for Marx the bourgeois society, but he understood what consent the continuity of the system is the economical plane, and the crisis produced from the social critique or political critique doesn't work to change the modes of production, the capitalistic system. And crisis was a dispositive to bring within the mode of production the social critique that comes from outside. So Marx understood that it was central, very important to use this economical dispositive. And he tried to, this is Grundrisse in particular, to say that, to invert, no? To convert the order of the judgment. No, it's we start not from the health, but we start from the ill of the system. So is the political intervention is to save the population health, changing the economical system, the capitalistic system. He used the same dispositive, but from an opposite point of view. He was, but you are agree. For Marx used this kind of the same crisis dispositive in economical sense to propose that the choice is forced, but not, of course, on the opposite point of view. You also, which is, you said also that you asked me about the difference between economical crisis and social crisis, right? Understood? No?
So, I try to propose that in order to fight the neoliberal use of crisis, we should resort to different kinds of reasoning. So instead of using those for and against judgments, even in our everyday life, in our interpersonal relations, maybe we should reason differently about the problems that we have in our personal, social, economic life, and so on. And that's why I try to be critical about of Marx, I guess, I'm not even sure, because I see that if we try to present that we only have two alternatives, and if we are Marxist and then we believe that the only alternative, the only force, the savior that we have, is to resort to revolution, then I'm not sure is that a good option, not because I do not believe in a revolution or I believe that the economic neoliberal system is a good one, but because I believe that this type of reasoning where we have two possibilities is in start a problematic one. And I think so because it seems to me that if you, as an individual, approach all the problems by thinking in two possibilities, and if I'm for this, then it means that I'm against that, it seems to me that in that way our minds could be very easily corrupted. And corrupted in the sense that someone will come to us and say, well, there is no alternative. The only alternative is to just strengthen neoliberal policies, for example. So in order to not to be corrupted, maybe we should just reconceptualize or reshape the way how we are discussing, how we are being critical about the things that are, I don't know, in the essence of the crisis. So I'm just, yeah, I hope you understand.
So I can ask to you with to asking also about some question from others on the decision without judgment, for example. So, but I think that the problem is the same. When I say judgment, I mean a pronunciation on alternatives already posed. This is for me the fundamental point of view. I quote in the English book a sentence of Jon Elster, is a philosopher that studied rational choice theory, and he said there is a very clear difference between choice and decision. Choice implies that there are already the terms on which I have to choose something. Decision, for deciding some words, doesn't presuppose an alternative in mind. This is the decision without judgment. Is a way of thinking without a presupposition of the terms of the choice. The power today, which is the power? The power is to pose this alternative, on which each one have to take her choice. This is the question for me. And we think that to say yes or not, I like, I don't like, is political. But, like Hannah Arendt say, for example, very political is to start a decision. Decision is a decision making. I try to, in the presentation of today, but in a work on which I'm working, to precise this term decision with a disclosure. It's a starting point. It's open. To speak about Kant, for example, is the Kant of Aufklärung, of Illuminism. No? what is Aufklärung for Kant? Is start something, no? Is come outside a state of minority, and so starting a new time, a new a new movement, a new process. This is the term of Kant. This is for me very interesting. Also Foucault worked on this text of this political text of Kant. So for me, today I will precise this term decision, and I can define it disclosure is how to do something. No, and it's not this come back to the term of a choice. This is for me very important. Also about trust. On which we have trust, on which other pose the terms. We have to. The market is the place of trust. No, we have to stabilize every time if we trust or not about this this proposal. No, we have to. It's another neoliberal, very important term. No, trust is a question also about evaluation. But the term is already posed. This is the problem. This is the difference for me between judgment and decision disclosure. And this is not a problem. Of course, I have anything against judgment. But it's important for me to understand why we used this kind of judgment pro and against for more situation than the originary situation on which this kind of judgment was thought. This is the problem for me. This ampliation of the field of judgment pro or against. Of course, there is other kind of judgment in Kant, for example. Reflexive judgment. I'm totally agree. This is the work of Hannah Arendt on Kant, the last text of Hannah Arendt. So absolutely, but I think that Kant is very important. But in the book, I limited the use of Kant on the judgment on I like, I don't like. I don't know in German which is the
Vorgefallen?
Geschmack.
Taste.
I like it, I don't like it. No? In Italian is giudizio di piacere. If we think today how many times we use the simple expression I like, I don't like for a lot of things, from political to aesthetic to what else. We think about social media. No, it's I like, I don't like. This was the problem from a Kantian point of view. Judgment in the reflexive sense, you say, or sublime, and the other kind of judicial on the beauty. The other, I don't know exactly the Kantian terms into English, so I improvise. And so the problem is that all the various kind of judgment in Kant became only the form of judgment I like, I don't like. This is the problem for me. Kant was very clear on this point. He criticized this to confuse, no, the different forms of judgment, and it was for him very clear that it's very easy. It's very, very easy to confuse other forms of judgment with the more direct and simple form of judgment. Judgment for or against, I like, I don't like. This is the point about Kant for me. But I find in Kant, not only in the third critique, but also in the text of Klärung, the political texts, I found that this possibility of thinking this disclosure as an alternative in confront of judgment. We have also to think that you say, yeah, this I absolutely I have no political theological point of view. Think about that. The final judgment is a kind of judgment pro or against, guilt or innocence, in paradise or in the hell. No, it's very interesting. I did it in the book to find, like Plato, this model of final judgment was used in a very different way than later in Christianity. So it's not less important how the assumption of Christianity of the judgment pro or against as final judgment gave this great importance on this kind of judgment. This is not something less important than the rest, no? And yes, there is this aesthetical background. I agree. Critique is the mode, no, of judgment. And it was unpolitical until the pre-revolution, French Revolution time. No, critique was something on the theater, on the art, and so on. It wasn't a political judgment. So I'm sure that I'm not answered well and completely to your questions, but yeah, for me maybe it's a lot of questions was about this, not this way out crisis. No, for me it's not that to answer to you. It's today. It's not the way is not to stay in crisis and to find within crisis the way out. When crisis, this kind of judgment became an act of government. So my solution, my way out is to try to go beyond crisis. This is my attempt with the term decision, disclosure without judgment.
Thanks very much. So now we will have a short break, 10 minutes.
Okay, so welcome to the second session. We will also have 3 speakers, and we will start with George Christoph.
Thank you. First, I want to say that I'm very pleased to have had the opportunity to read this book. The genealogy of the concept of the crisis that you trace engaged me on many levels. And what I like the most about it are the similarities and the differences that you pointed out between the ancient and the modern, as well as the contemporary experience of crisis. I was inspired by the comparison between the crisis of the ancient polis and that of modern politics, between the rise of hegemonic imperial orders in Greece and Rome and our modern neoliberal incorporation of nation-state sovereignty. And both events activated the Deleuzian lines of flight or escape that you referred to and that are traced in times of crisis. The downfall of the ancient city-state led to the Hellenistic cosmos, which itself became a refuge for individuals alienated from political community, as you claim. The neoliberal cosmos, on the other hand, activates its own lines of escape, and some are present, I think, in your text as well. Now, I believe that we can all agree that, as you write, it is necessary to act in another cosmos, one which would not be defined by precariousness imposed by neoliberalism. This would be, and I quote you again, a cosmos of political life in common, as in Plato's polis. You reference Plato here, who also wrote in times of crisis, that of the ancient polis itself, and who aspired to restore a more archaic order mediated by philosophy. And you also reference Nietzsche through Benjamin and the idea of the Dionysian rapture, the communal ecstatic contact with the cosmos, as an alternative to the cosmos of neoliberalism. And following in the arguments of Deleuze and Guattari, you write that this would entail a new type of conflict as a common expression of life, juxtaposed to the competitive precariousness of the market. You evoke the ancient intercourse with the cosmos, the joyful elation that is derived only from the shared political form of life. Now, I understood these lines precisely in the Deleuzian sense as lines of escape, and as I was reading the book, especially the inspiring parts on the medical sense of crisis, Roman historians came to my mind, such as Livy or Sallust, also wrote during a period of crisis, the crisis of the Roman Republic. And they also had this habit of writing in terms of disease and health, expressing their resignation due to impotence of any cure. This was something that came to my mind when you're thinking about your thesis on the absence of a conclusive decision, or the inability for a decision to resolve the current crisis. Livy, for example, writes that the Romans can now tolerate neither their vices nor their remedies. They are stuck in a limbo of the present times. Sallust complained how individual avarice and ambition appeared as a contagion that invaded the Republic as a plague. Of course, as you observed, the ancients understood the healthy condition as the original state to which we must return. Thus, Livy saw his historical enterprise as a healthy act to recapture the spirit of the old republic. However, this aspiration toward the common was already in antiquity coupled with a longing for a different kind of conflict, specifically for old wars that were now extinguished under the Pax Romana. Sallust, for example, writes that the old enmities, which, as he says, preserved good political practices, have now given way to a peace more cruel and bitter than adversity. This is something which is echoed in Deleuze and Guattari's analysis of neoliberalism. They write of the neoliberal peace, which is more terrifying than fascist death. What they also call the peace of terror or survival. An observation I believe is similar to yours when you describe the age of precarity as an age of exposure to death and necessity for adaptation. Now, of course, in distinction to these ancient authors who longed for old enmities, old wars, the archaisms which Deleuze and Guattari traced in their work do not aspire to return to the original state. There can be no return to the old relations between nation-state sovereigns. On the contrary, the lines of escape they trace go in direction of creating new kinds of combat. As you observe, one that bring out the joyful as opposed to sad passions, something they try to achieve through their concept of the war machine. And these are some of the ideas that came to my mind when you wrote of the Dionysian rapture. It was Nietzsche who argued that because we have forgotten how to wage wars, we are now left with either beautiful soulism or fanaticism. However, it was also Nietzsche who wanted to undermine the one-sided notion of joy that the ancient intercourse with the cosmos provided, and more specifically to undermine the idea of antiquity based on what he calls, and I quote, the horrible, whitewashed image of the ideal Greeks. Nietzsche writes, for example, that the moderns revolt against the forceful realization of the degree to which cruelty is part of the festive joy of the ancients. We should not forget that Dionysius is not just the god of wine and dance, but also the god who, as Walter Otto observed, incites man to savagery and to lust for blood. War, cruelty, and pain, Nietzsche argues, are one of the oldest festive joys of mankind. And this is then this other side of the ancient communal expression of joy, conflict and war, but not the Hobbesian war, where exposure to death is a solitary experience of precariousness, the kind of individual anxiety in a war of all against all, but war where the fullness of life, as Nietzsche writes, goes hand in hand with the violence of death. In other words, this is a common confrontation with death, a conflict where violence is performed in common and suffered in common, as an expression of a shared cosmos presided by the same gods to whom these sacrifices are made. And this is also a line of thought that Deleuze and Guattari, following Nietzsche, develop in Anti-Oedipus, when they write of cruelty and pain as the essential ingredients of conflict and community in primitive societies. Now, of course, as mentioned, there is no return to this world, inasmuch there is no return to modern politics. I view these archaisms as possible lines of escape, avenues for becoming, but I refer here to Deleuze and Guattari because they also, like Nietzsche, wanted to draw attention to the other side of these lines. As they often point out in their writings on fascism, what they call the fascism of the right, of the left, or what Foucault, also in relation to them, termed the fascism in us, these lines of escape can always turn to lines of abolition and destruction. And I found your reference to their concept of the body without organs in this regard relevant. The body without organs is a self-expression of power that does not adapt to judgment, a conflict in which power is expressed in common. As Deleuze and Guattari write, the body without organs is inevitable exercise or experimentation. But they also point out this experimentation can always be botched, sometimes in most horrific ways possible. So my question is, in our philosophical and abstract appeal to a new type of conflict, to a new form of combat, one which traces a line of escape to the Dionysian rapture, to the ancient experience of the cosmos, are we not in danger of actually achieving this experience? Because, for example, just one example, there are the philosophical lines of escape traced by Rousseau during the emerging bourgeois society that led him to Sparta and the Roman Republic. But there is also the historical Sparta that taught its young boys to hunt and kill helots for sport, just as there is the Sparta and the Roman Republic of Robespierre. So there is this discrepancy between the philosophical appeal to the ancient experience as a line of escape in times of crisis, something that has been repeated many times throughout the history of philosophy, Plato's Polis, Machiavelli's Rome, or Rousseau's Sparta, Arendt's or Heidegger's Greece, and then the actual experience of this rapture. So how can these archaisms, which as Deleuze and Guattari claim can be emancipatory, also be prevented from leading us into the necessity of political violence? Would our inability to wage wars, as Nietzsche has argued, manifest the rapture, the communal rapture, also in fanaticism, because the word der Rausch can also mean intoxication, frenzy. How can we trace a line of escape toward the Dionysian rapture that would not entail cruelty or pain? Or alternatively, the question could be, would cruelty and pain be a necessary condition for this new shared experience of conflict? Thank you.
Thank you, George. And now we turn to Milan Urošević.
Thank you. So, first I would like to thank you, Professor Gentili, for the chance to discuss your interesting book. I think it's really a kind of an exciting read and a long overdue theoretical reflection on what has been going on since 2008 and the way that the governments and other institutions have been behaving in the face of this crisis. It is I think it's an important theoretical contribution alongside some other works like those of Colin Crouch or Philip Mirovsky, who, although get stuck in discussing neoliberal ideas, neoliberal theories, I think that your book gives a kind of a more overall theoretical reflection. So there is something interesting I've noticed while reading your book, namely that you use Baudelaire's idea of the flaneur, I think that's how it's pronounced, as like a first sign of the beginning, the origin of the form of life of the precarious subject that later becomes dominant in the age of neoliberal crisis system. What seems interesting to me here is that Foucault also uses this idea of the flaneur, but in a different way. He mentions it in his essay, What is Enlightenment, but he uses it as an example of the lived ethos of the Enlightenment, which presupposes that the individual invents himself or herself by constantly reflecting on the conditions of his own existence. Foucault sees this as a critical ethos, a way of life which by its very form criticizes power structures and forms of governmentality. Even though you don't mention this, it seems to me that you noticed, in a way maybe, that his idea, Foucault's idea of the emancipated individual, the emancipated subject, or a way of life that is emancipatory, seems eerie similar to neoliberal subjectivity, which he calls the homo economicus. Now, what I'm referring to here is a subjectivity which is constantly changing and shaping itself. In the case of the precarious subject you talk about, it is a change aimed at adapting to contingent events, while in Foucault's case, it is the emancipated subject that stylizes himself in accordance with the aesthetic criteria that he or she chose. It seems to me that precisely this idea of the freely changing subject that is its own master is something that neoliberalism has co-opted as a form of life that can be used to govern subjects in the time of crisis. Since, as you show, it is up to the subjects themselves now to adapt to new and ever-changing conditions of existence and the conditions on the market. Therefore, it is not the system of governments, in a way, that imposes this form of subjectivity, values, norms, etc., but the subject himself feels that he or she is the originator of their form of subjectivity or the form of life. What I like most about your book is that in the final part, you point to the necessity of political action in a communal or a collective form. Therefore, the emancipatory route you point to isn't in individualist self-stylization, which is the case in Foucault's work. So you propose a new cosmos, not the one in which the laws of the market govern social interactions and institutions, but the one in which political conflict has a kind of a productive function of negotiating forms of life in that political community. What I found in a kind of way lacking in that part of the book is maybe a description, more precise description of the transitory element, transitory period, or a way of conceptualizing the transition between those two governing systems, the neoliberal one and the new political communal one. The conceptualization would, in my opinion, entail three questions that should be answered, and those are precisely my questions to you. So the first one is the question of the subject of change. What would be the subject or subjects of that transition to the new type of cosmos? The market as a form of governments is a specific form for its inclusivity. It doesn't exclude any kind of individual, at least not in principle. In a way, this in this cosmos, we're all subjected to those same principles. So it seems to me that the question of the subject of change is in that way very interesting. The second question is directly related to the first one, and it's about the reasons for a change in this governing system. Of course, neoliberalism and its way of governing through crisis produces huge amounts of poverty, insecurity, mental problems, etc., name it. But as you mentioned, this leads to requests for security, which could be seen as a reason for the rise of populist right-wing parties, which promise the protection from migrants and other minorities. My question is, why would subjects, individuals or social movements, whoever, that are affected by the pathologies of neoliberalism choose to act in a way that would bring about the cosmos you mentioned, and not, let's say, some new disciplinary fascistic form of governance? The last question is about the way you envision that transformation from one form of governments to the other. Since the form of governments also entails the governing of political institutions, and in neoliberalism, those institutions are subjected to economistic logic of the market, do you think that the change of that system must be extra political, or in other words, does it have to come from outside the current political system? Or do you think that working through the current political system, certain groups or movements, whoever, can influence that system to induce a change in the logic of the governance? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Milan. And the third and final intervention in this panel will come from Damir Zane-Ulahovic.
Thank you. First, I would, of course, like to thank you for coming and for the book, which is really interesting, and I especially enjoyed the parts dealing with the genealogy of crisis, and especially Marx and Gramsci, so I will probably focus on that, and in that tradition, not in the tradition of crisis itself. So I understand that developing the idea of crisis as a dispositive is the main goal of the book, but my questions deal with another aspect that, although it seems secondary in the book, it's still given ample space, I think, so at least. So even though you define the precariat as a form of life rather than a class, I mean, it's a distinction you make. It is nonetheless true that you use you use the expressions like the precariat worker, the worker on the market. The precarious worker is a worker all the same. I think in your envision, in the way that you define it. And the precariat of today, unlike the genealogical beginning of the precariat in Paris and in the time of 18th Brumaire, and from where you draw the line, is not recruited from the lumpen proletariat. It's recruited from the dying remnants of the once proletariat. So in that sense, I read your work also about a book about class relations. So I would like to ask a question: what changes can we identify in the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class in this new cosmos of neoliberal cosmos? Is there a change that happened in their formation, in their reproduction, on the market itself, or is there not? Is there nothing? Is just the precariat the life form given from the neoliberal cosmos? And the second question also deals with class relations, and it seems to me that Hayek's neoliberal cosmos and utopia and the use of the dispositive of the crisis have the same goal in mind. Let's say if the neoliberal cosmos of spontaneous order is the market, as you say on page 74, which criterion is the evolutional reproduction or self-preservation, and the function of the dispositive is in establishing and enforcing power relations and subjectification, then I see neoliberalism in, let's say, a similar path as Harvey, as a project of class struggle, a sort of reconquest of the capitalist class after the glorious 30 years, or however you want to call it. Even, and I see it as that, even if we limit it to the reproduction of the market in its self-preservation, as it presupposes private property and class relations in Hayek, for sure. In view of that, I would say that the use of the dispositive of the crisis placed in Gramscian interregnum as a means of a constant recalibrating of the hegemony of the ruling class is a precise analysis. So I would like to ask you for a clarification of your stance on page 78, where you say, and I quote, class conflict is no longer capable of posing alternatives outside of the neoliberal market, and that the notion of conflict turns into a function of the government. And I would especially like a comment on that second part, given what George said, and I think what Milan alluded to in his third question about how does this new government mentality come? How does it achieve itself in the world? So.
Okay, thank you, Damir. And now the floor is yours, Dario.
So thank you very much. Also in this case, a lot of very important and difficult questions to answer briefly and in English, but I try to say something to answer together. So the idea of Cosmos, I'm happy that you introduced this idea. It's very important for me, for the book. What is Cosmos for me? Cosmos is in general a way of an immanent order, an impersonal order. It's the real alternative to the idea of sovereignty in modern time, but not only. There is the idea that for the individual, also if individuals don't have the capacity to understand the sense of totality, they trust that there is a sense. There is an order. It's a very important idea. It's an alternative idea to the sovereign system, to the system of law, to the system of personal power, and so on. So I find anything wrong in this idea. We need, as human beings, to have faith that there is a sense in nature, in the world, in the real, that our actions are connected in some ways. I'm very impressed that Hayek, of course, the neoliberal reference thinker, used this idea of cosmos. And I think that the neoliberal cosmos is to adapt this real anthropological idea of an impersonal or an immanent order within a system characterized by this idea of rational choice theory. And I come back to the problem of choice. What is rational choice theory? This idea that in each case, each individual choices for the optimized, more advantageous option. Every time Hayek said, at the end, each the most great possibility of choice is reduced to one choice. The most ottimale, I don't know in English, optimal choice. So this is this idea that cosmos functions in this way. This idea that there is no way, no other way than the most straight on the goal. So this is a way of function of cosmos. This is today it's the way of a kind of algorithmic cosmos. It's a mentality. It's not only a mathematical order. It's a kind of mentality. We act on this idea to go fast, straight on. There is only one option, the best one, the optimal one. This is the idea of neoliberal cosmos. And we think as an algorithm. Algorithm is not only a mathematical operation. Algorithm is a mentality. We think as algorithms. The algorithm is a kind of it's a mathematical operation for to do the less operations to achieve a goal. This is not something about mathematics. It's something about our way of act, of living, of choose at the end. So this is an idea of also the Pythagoras, the ancient Greek cosmos was mathematical, but it was different of this kind of algorithmic cosmos. So I think that what is important for me when I speak about a new cosmos is the idea to can take another way, to have a chance to take another way that is not necessarily the most direct, the most optimal way to achieve a goal. This is my idea of new cosmos at the end. And this is why I propose to think in terms of decision of disclosure than in terms of choice. Because when we think in terms of choice, we are within this algorithmic mentality. So this is very, very, very important for me to continue to use this term cosmos, because it means, I repeat, an immanent order, a sense, a general sense that each individual cannot understand. What about your question? Yes, about for me, for example, Machiavelli is very important, no? As a thinker, to think this idea of conflict, because what in particular in discourse on Livy, Machiavelli say that and he uses medical terms. He said that the alteration is the best way to preserve the order. So the problem is what, in particular? Disease is not the alternative to life. Disease is conflict. Disease or conflict for Machiavelli, but we can use this idea also today, is the way to renovate the order without alteration, without, for Machiavelli, the Roman Republic, but the city, the political order is like a body. Also, the alteration is a way to renovate, to reinvigorate the political body. So conflict is not the alternative to the order, but conflict is what consents to the order to preserve itself. the change and the preservation are not alternatives. This is a way to think not within the dispositive of crisis, no? Health or illness or disease, but to think together, order and conflict, order and disease. Now, this is so. I agree with you. It's very, very important. Very important is also the question about rapture. In Italy, I received a lot of questions, also critical questions about this point, and maybe it's too fast as I explain this passage in the book. And today, what could say? Maybe I would use the notion of Benjamin, organization of pessimism. Why? Benjamin used this notion in the essay on surrealism, and in that essay, Benjamin tries to understand how to keep together the individual revolt and the organization of revolution. For Benjamin, first of all, there is the individual revolt. This is the side of pessimism. It's a situation that I cannot more continue to bear, to have, no? And I try to, but this is only violence. This is only a reaction in the term of violence. This is something against. Okay, it's enough for me. I rebel against. And the idea of Benjamin was to organize this kind of individual pessimism and revolt. This kind of rupture also. And to and it's not necessary in this idea of Benjamin of organization of pessimism that this kind of organization is violent. Violent is sure probably the reaction to the stress, to the unlivable situation, world, society. Probably it's violent, this individual reaction. But the idea of Benjamin is to organize in a common way this plane of individual pessimism. Today, I think we can understand what is this individual pessimism. We can't go beyond this pessimism. The situation is no more supportable. I don't remember the
Bearable.
Bearable. Bearable. Okay, bearable. Thank you. And but the problem is this political translation, this political passage beyond the individual pessimism. And also about rupture, I follow more Benjamin than Nietzsche, of course, or than Deleuze. No? For Benjamin, the rupture was, he uses also this Nietzschean expression, rupture, also in this essay on surrealism. And also in this case, his proposal was to use this individual rupture in a political way. I can say also in a cosmic way. And I think it's not, of course, the solution of anything, but it's a way to in 90s, neoliberalism was understood as a kind of hedonistic system. It's not so. It's a depressive system. So we have, maybe it's the time to understand that this kind of rupture of that is individual could be thought in a political way, in a cosmic way, in this sense, to share this individual rupture beyond the individual, of course. So this is the Benjamin's idea of cosmos, and in relation to Nietzsche rupture in genealogy, the birth of tragedy. Baudelaire, Foucault, yeah, I'm totally agree. I follow Benjamin also in this case, not Foucault. You are totally right. In Foucault, thought about aesthetic and individual, in Baudelaire, use of the self. And for Benjamin, I think Benjamin, it's today very important, not only for a lot of reasons, but to think the individuality. I think that Benjamin is one of the not so many Marxists that tried to think the individual. For Benjamin, the very problem of Marxism was to lack the opportunity to think the individuality. And I tried to to do it, I think, in Baudelaire's book, that he don't accomplish them, so we know. Which was the problem for Benjamin in Baudelaire? Baudelaire, until 1848, he was on the barricades with Blanqui. Then he became a conservative, followed the master theories, and he endorsed the Neapolitan III government. And for Benjamin, the problem was this kind of individuality, this bohemian individuality. We can, how to bring within a communist, leftist politics, and don't leave to the market, to the conservative regimes. So how to use it, to come back to the question of before, how to use this individual pessimism in a political way. I think it's also a problem of today. How to use this pessimism, how to use this depression, how to use this lack of alternatives that individuals feel so strong in a political way. I don't know here in Serbia, but in Italy there is really a psychological problems, depression, anxiety, and so on the individual way. How to use this pessimism in a new politics, in a new cosmos. This is, I open the question. I don't solve the problem, of course. The transition to the new cosmos, and I come also to your question. I see in the world some interesting situations. I think today it's very complicated now, but the ecological question is interesting for me from this point of view. And for example, this phenomenon of the Great Resignation in the United States, but not only, there is also in Italy. There is a lot of young people in Italy that doesn't want work anymore. They don't need anymore a lot of money to live. It's enough reddito di cittadinanza. I don't know how to say.
Sorry?
Basic income.
Sorry?
Basic income.
Didn't understand.
Basic income.
Basic income, cittadinanza.
Reddito di cittadinanza. It's enough for a lot for many young people. It's enough. There is a polemic now because important chef in Italy say young people don't want work hard. And they respond, okay, we prefer basic income to work all the time, included the weekend and so on. This is a kind of silence but it's a kind of individual rebellion. And there is another phenomenon very interesting, not only in Italy, also in other European countries. And it's a phenomenon that became stronger with pandemic. The precarity, this precariousness, it's in particular this intellectual labor, this cognitive labor and so on, choose to go in the countryside, to abandon, to leave the cities. But not to, for example, it's a kind of subtraction. It's productive. They produce new kind of also economies, also organization, also communities. But it's not like in the 70s it's a kind of small communities. It's a way to continue the work in the city, outside the city, outside the neoliberal places. And I think that the neoliberalism is the last, to use the category, the notion of Gramsci, passive revolution. It's a way to use the new the creativity of the subalternal subalternal classes to go on with to change, to up to date the system. For Gramsci, which was the most important passive revolution, the idea of progress. Gramsci said the real bourgeois idea that at the end won against also the Marxist movement of the working class movement was the idea of progress. I think that now it's the first time from since a couple of centuries that this idea doesn't work anymore. I think that now always less people think that people tomorrow get it better than yesterday. I don't know what will happen, but I think that it's something new that is happening today. No? My parents were sure that I could have a better position than them. The young people do not trust in it anymore. So this is not this is not a revolution, but I find some interesting signals around. Something is changing. I think it's not the same. It's not the same, and well, we'll see.
Okay, thank you, Dario. Thanks to all the participants on this, I think, really important panel where we address some important issues and raise some intuitions about the future and some of the stuff that we are dealing on the daily level. So thank you all. I think that we could, given the time, move to the third panel right straight ahead. Right now I will give the floor to slobodno ostanite. Da bude bude. So I will give the floor to Marian right now.
Thanks. Well, we've already heard many very interesting questions and your responses. I'm just like to maybe slightly elaborate on certain issues that have already been raised by a number of speakers, primarily by Igor, and also by Milan and Damir, I think, and which concern this kind of peculiarity of the present moment, which at the same time seems like a completely inescapable predicament on the one hand, and on the other hand seems like a certain opening towards something radically new. So let me just begin by observing that the term dispositive that you rely on in the Foucauldian sense of the term is a very complicated and I would say holistic concept which fuses within itself various distinct logics of action integration. I'm going to speak in this social theoretical kind of jargon a bit. Various logics of action integration, and for a good reason, because capitalism is a holistic order of social reproduction. I would certainly agree with that. And you can't really make an empirical distinction there between material processes of reproduction and symbolic processes of reproduction. But I think it is important that we try to introduce analytical distinctions there, which might help us maybe explicate this very important logic of self-overcoming of capitalism that you thematize in the book. So what I'm going to try to do is maybe slightly reformulate your argument within this language and then ask whether I'm correct, whether I read the implications of your argument correctly, and what this means for our present political moment. So if we understand capitalism as a holistic order of societal reproduction, which nevertheless operates, I would say, on two distinct levels, and we can use the term first order processes and second order processes, maybe this distinction by Harry Frankfurt, to distinguish between what you call in the book processes of subjectivation, and which I think is the fundamental plane of capitalism, which operates at the level of the very structuring of capitalism through the commodity principle and the exchange principle. And then the second order processes of legitimation, which you also deal with in the book, which are basically processes of integrating critique within the institutional order. So when you say crisis is an art of government, the way I understand it is whenever there is a challenge to the capitalist order coming from the realm of contingency, what capitalism does basically is that when these challenges manifest themselves at the level of social actors' discontent, the way their normative demands are articulated is such that it reinforces the capitalist order in the end. But what this means is that at the level of politics, the critique of the order that is articulated is such that it leads to an innovation of the very system of material reproduction. So if we look at the French Revolution or let's say the 1920s that you thematize in the book, I would say what you're arguing is that this decisive moment of political decision, a step into the unknown, is within capitalism always a step towards an innovation of the system of material reproduction, let's say industrialization, or in the 1920s and 30s, the development of Keynesianism and so on. Now, what is specific about the neoliberal dispositive, and I think that that's a very far-reaching argument that you make, is that this whole mechanism of self-overcoming of capitalism, which works at these two levels, so that when there is a disturbance in the economic reproduction, the political decision leads to a strengthening of the system of material production through innovation. This mechanism is actually destabilized because the development of the neoliberal ideology as some kind of adaptive change within capitalism that takes place since 1970s develops a kind of discourse of legitimation that is extremely powerful, and that as you say, institutionalizes permanent crisis as the art of government, which basically means that no disturbance of the material reproduction of the system can any longer be used as a basis for critique, because this disturbance is already anticipated at the level of the ideology. The ideology basically says we are living in a constant situation of disturbance, of crisis, and we constantly have to respond to it in ways that are already predetermined by the basic premises of our ideology, of the ideology that Hayek has articulated in the most systematic fashion. So what this means basically is that from the 70s onwards, the objective dysfunctionality of material reproduction can now coexist with perfect functionality of second-order processes of legitimation. And this, of course, culminates in the 2008 crisis, where we have a huge dysfunctionality of material reproduction, falling rates of profit, structural crisis of material reproduction, which is not followed by any kind of major challenge to the legitimacy of the order, precisely because it has already been anticipated at this level. So the crisis, the 2008 crash, let's not use the word crisis, it served to further strengthen the capitalist order, even though there is no real solution to the problems of material reproduction. So we now have this unique predicament where people are suffering in an objective sense, let's say that way. But there is no way of articulating this subjectively. There is no way of articulating this at the second order level into some kind of political innovation which would enable the fixing of the economic system, like in the 1930s. And this is how I understand the nature of the interregnum that you talk about. And the old is dying and the new cannot be born. The old is dying because there is a structural crisis of capitalism at the level of material production, which is now permanent due to a host of factors. On the other hand, the new cannot be born because the techniques of subjectivation are still working perfectly in the sense of the neoliberal dispositive of permanent crisis and of crisis as an art of government. So basically, I also understand you mentioned new populisms as the present day attempts at what you call the non-organic solution, just like fascism in the 1920s, in the Gramscian sense. But the distinction is that in those days, there was this non-organic solution in terms of charismatic leaders in the fascist movement, but there was also a serious attempt at an organic resolution coming from within the system, which would be the Keynesian solution. Whereas nowadays, we do have the non-organic attempts at resolution, but we have no organic attempts at resolution, precisely because there is no progressive political articulation of the dysfunctionality of capitalism. We could then, in those terms, say that the people today are suffering objectively, but not subjectively, or not articulately. And this creates a unique condition that I think also Igor was trying to point to, an opportunity for some kind of going beyond, but this cannot be done in ordinary sense, of ordinary articulations of social change. And this is where to conclude, I see your proposal for a new cosmos based on conflict without struggle to the death as a very fruitful proposal. If we understand it along these lines, systems theoretical, let's call them for lack of a better term, if we see this proposal as a kind of framework for mobilizing these inarticulate experiences of suffering in an innovative way, I think the idea of conflict without struggle to the death means that we could understand ourselves as members of different social groups which are in conflict with each other, because at this level of worldviews, we do not agree. We are fragmented, and we cannot reach an intersubjective agreement in the sense of overarching revolutionary agenda. But what unites us is this objective state of suffering. And there is some kind of inarticulate understanding of this, some kind of intuition of this, which is a potential. And if we could have what you call a decision without judgment, or this kind of articulation without substantive normative judgments, as a kind of explicit framework for political action, I think that can be very fruitful for actually creating a comprehensive social movement of members of very different normative groups, and so on and so forth. So what my question is basically, would you agree with this interpretation of your perspective? And would you agree that we are then really in a position that there is cause for optimism in that sense? Thanks.
Thank you, Marian. And now I will have two short interventions. So first of all, I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to have to discuss your book. And I also appreciate the whole idea of trying to envision crisis as a function, as a dispositive. But my intervention here will be to see whether or not there are some hidden costs in this strategy, theoretical strategy. So, because crisis is also sometimes defined in terms of a type of event. And when it is defined, and in complexity theory, for example, it's defined as a type of event, then the authors, for example, Sylvia Walby and some other, usually say that what's important in crisis is disproportionality between the cause and the effect. This is what constitutes the crisis. And if we only refer to it as a function, as something which incorporates contingency into social order, then I think that we lose this kind of non-linear determinism, which is exactly needed for us to run away from this huge pulling power of neoliberalism. So I was just trying, what I'm trying to say is whether or not we could have this kind of, could you incorporate this articulation of crisis within your framework that you offer in your book? Because some intuitions of mine would be that it can be done, but I don't know. You'll be the judge of that. So, and the second question is.
Sorry, I answered very well the first question. So this function, this crisis as dispositive.
So yeah, it's defined as a type of if you see it as a function and not as a type of event, then you lose this kind. I think that you will be you will have to renounce the non-linear aspects of crisis. So what constitutes is a crisis, for example, in complexity theory, some of the authors, is exactly that you don't have a contingency plan. When you have a contingency plan, you don't have a crisis. So the crisis is where a small amount, a small agency, a small, different view articulated can have huge potential on the social system. So this is what complexity theory or system theory would say. So how does this work with your idea about crisis as a dispositive? So just some intuitions or comments. It would be really interesting to hear. And the second, I'm a sociologist, although a theoretical sociologist, so it's now some time for some sociological questions. So you define crisis as something which occurs in the West or in the globe as a global phenomenon. But what about crisis on the periphery of the social system? Crisis in Greece, or crisis of the Soviet Union, or the Yugoslav crisis. So what about local crises? And this is also interconnected also with the idea of nonlinear determinism. Perhaps there is a play there that could be utilized also. So those are only I know short intervention, but I think that we can have some productive debate about. So now I will stop because it's time also for Peter to have some short.
I'm very happy. I'm responsible for this event. I'm very happy that you accepted to be here with us. Okay, I read this book. I think Economical now playing in Italian, and then well, you know, there are many details. I like how you construct the book, how your analysis, your quotations, etc., etc. I saw that I remember that you worked in Düsseldorf in archive, and there are many unknown references. Well, okay. My question is crisis today. How you can, because parallelly I had, you know, I lost the luggage. Parallelly I read Economist, and I saw the problems in China's economy, and the announcement of Ukrainian government against Kissinger, etc., etc. How you can describe with your perspective what we have today? Is it crisis? Which kind of crisis? How to recognize your instruments or your, I don't know, protocols you invented in your book today, and say something about today. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, so Dario, please, the floor is yours.
So, about I totally agree with your reconstruction on these two levels of neoliberalism in general, and this that we can find also in this distinction in Gramsci between organic crisis and non-organic crisis. And I also agree with you that often these two levels play together, of course. If we translate this distinction in Gramsci between organic and non-organic crisis, today I could say that organic crisis is the technical government. There is a political, economical crisis, and there is a government of expertise. It happened in Italy, in Holland, in a lot of European countries in particular. This idea that there is an expertise for managing crisis, economic crisis. Non-organic crisis is neo-sovereignisms and neopopulisms. There is this idea of strong leader. There is this idea of security that it seems alternative to organic crisis. But in a way, it's within the neoliberalism order. I recall often discussing the book that the country in which for the first time neoliberalism was experimented was Chile of Pinochet. And it's useful to have a strong government that say, okay, this precarity that market produces is arranged, and this is the production of the enemy outside, migrants, and so on. This is not an exception. I think a kind of not intentioned consequence, but is structural to the neoliberal system. So I could say, in reference to Gramsci, that today there is not this alternative between organic and non-organic crisis, but they play sometimes also together. And I think that there is these two levels. For me, crisis, there is a level, you say rightly, on the institutional level. But there is also a rhetorical level. And the dispositive of crisis works on this, most on this level, also in this organic, non-organic crisis and so on. But it's important the construction of the discourse of the crisis. So, what I mean, to answer to Peter also, no? For example, in this situation of the war, crisis does not imply that I have to go in Ukraine to fight for Russia or for Ukraine. This is not this kind of concrete position. But what I say that when we in this kind of judgment between two alternatives, the war, of course, is natural that is so. This choice, no, we have to choice. In Italy, also the talk show, but also amongst the people on the street. No, there is I am for, or no, I am against this one. But it's very interesting for me to see that there is a clear option, and this clear option is not for for Ukraine, for example. This is the government option, of course, but is an endorsement of the neoliberal order, the geopolitical order. This is the two levels that play together in crisis dispositif. This idea that there is a choice that is not only for this part, this particular part, but is a forced choice that implies the endorsement for the entirety of the system, of the neoliberal order, for example. So when to say today in Italy, okay, it was we have to, the government say we have to take part for Ukraine. This implies automatically and naturally to be for NATO, to be for free market, to be for I don't know, all the current organization, to be for European Union in this as European Union now is. It's not this a real choice. It's a kind of endorsement for a level that is the endorsement for a kind of order. Yeah. Also about how not only organize but how to keep together, no, this precariousness between different classes or works. I have a friend. He's a syndicalist, and he works with the precarious workers. And he said me that the most difficult thing is that you try to keep together the different, no, from outside. He understands that there is something in common, of course. But the first things that each precarious worker says is, my case is not the case of the other one. My case is different. This is a political problem, because in each way, okay, he's a rider. I'm not a rider. I work in school. I'm a precarious worker in the school. I'm not a rider. It's totally different. I'm sorry for him or her, but I'm something else. This is actually a great problem to organize. No, how you say also this precariousness has something in common.
It proves that the techniques of subjectivation still work very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
That fragment people, even though the economy doesn't work. Yes.
I think that in a different way, I said it before, in a different way as in the book, I think that what is in common is this pessimism from each kind of people, from each situation. It's something interesting for me. I'm thinking about it. This idea that no one from an ecological point of view, a political point of view, a working point of view is optimistic about the future. This is something that is changing, I think. So maybe this pessimism, this still individual pessimism, is a starting point of view to think a kind of politics or organization. I quoted before Walter Benjamin, no? the organization of pessimism, and I said also that the stronger point of all the passive revolutions for Gramsci is this idea of progress, so of optimism. And I think that this kind of idea is dying, no? And is it an opportunity? Maybe. Maybe it's easier to find something in common in this pessimism between the precarious workers or this perception of precariousness that each one we have, then to say, okay, we are all together in the same condition of precariousness. Maybe if we say all together we are in a condition of pessimism about the future, there is no the progress is not a guarantee for the future. it's not a condition that maybe no one can can be sure. Yeah, this positive function. I'm not a sociologist, so in a philosophical way it's different. But to answer in a very briefly way, the dispositif of crisis does historical contingency a kind of natural variation. So this is the idea that, okay, there is still a kind of contingency, but it's something natural and it's not something historical, so something that has a kind of causes behind, a kind of situation that produces. This is a Foucaultian idea, that neoliberalism is fundamentally a kind of naturalization, also of contingency, I think. I don't know if I answered to you in a sociological way, but I think that there is the crisis as dispositif who works in this sense, in a continuous conversion of history in nature. This is the idea of medical judgment, of illness. It's the same way, no? It's not. It doesn't work every time, of course, no. But it's a kind of attempt also to, in the pandemic, for example, it was this, no, okay, it happens, no, it's a contingency, and it's very different that enters, and I hope so, it works, that it's not nature, but it's a kind of politics around the world, it's a kind of sfruttamento.
Sorry, sfruttamento. What's the context?
Sfruttamento in agriculture, the change of the reduction of the forests, so the change in
so the transformation
in life of
yes,
animals. Yes. No, this change.
Utilization, a kind of utilization, I would
Utilization.
say. Sfruttamento.
Sì,
Okay.
but anyway, it's the human interventions in also in China, for example, no, to reduce the habitat of some animal species, and so it's the same with the intensive agriculture in some other countries. It's not something natural. It's something that is a project of an economy, a politics, a policy, and so on. This is, I try to answer to your question. Also, local crisis. Yeah, of course. Each this is also to answer to Peter. Also, there is each crisis is local. Each crisis is different. Of course, I know better the European context. But as I said before, what is the dispositif in the second level of to compact people, also each one individually in difficulties, but compact together, is the rhetorical discourse of crisis. I think it's not so. Of course, there is each crisis is different, but there is in this dispositive, in each situation, an option that is this kind of option that has the goal to compact the public opinion under government option. This is the crisis dispositive. It's not something. If we try to understand each local crisis, each one is different. But the idea is that there is the same, but maybe the crisis discourse works similarly. There is always a better option. This is, in first time, the reduction of possibilities to a choice. And there is the indication of the better choice, and the better choice is ever for the conservation of the order. If there is something new, I think after the publication of the book, on which I'm thinking, is this idea that it's not so easy to do so, because there is this it's not so sure the idea that choosing for the government option, government in general option, is a guarantee for survival. It's a guarantee to go on. It's a guarantee for the best. I'm not so sure that it still works today. This is what I maybe what could, yeah, it's something about I'm still thinking, no? This idea of pessimism that can break with this condition of life or death, or survive and death.
Yeah, but that's so. Is pessimism also then a global thing? Because I suppose that Chinese people are currently perhaps not as pessimistic as, for example, Americans, or because they believe in problems. They have not absorbed all of the villagers. They still have a huge amount of industrialization to go on. So perhaps there is disbalance here also.
No, it's absolutely different. But I'm not the idea that we have to think a global revolution in the same time. But if somewhere someone organized something political to say it's not so good as we thought until now, maybe also Chinese people say, "Ben, insomma, it's not so good also here."
Yeah.
I know I'm not an expertise, but I speak with people that work on China and situation. There is a lot of shopping. It's a lot of manifestations, but they are repressed, of course. But also this news don't arrive to us. So I don't think that Chinese people is so optimistic. Maybe it's optimistic in the development of technology and so on, but I don't think that in a personal and psychological sense they are so good.
Okay, so if there are any more questions from the public, perhaps. Okay. Yeah. So first of all, it was truly a privilege to have you here. I truly enjoyed all of the topics. I think that we addressed some of the key issues that we are dealing and that we will be dealing in the future. So thank you for coming, and thank you to all the participants for, I think, great interventions. Give yourself a round of applause.